Welcome to the Micromobility Podcast. I'm Prabin Joel Jones, your host, and I'm here with Horace Dediu, our OG host of the show.
OG.
He came back on the pod a month or two ago, and it was very well received. And I also have to thank Riley from Trucks VC, who actually writes a newsletter, sends out a newsletter, and he picked that up and he mentioned, Horace is back on the podcast. So that was nice to read. And we had many topics that we wanted to talk about in that podcast. Because of time constraints, we did not. And so that's exactly what we're going to talk about. Right. Before we jump into the episode, a few announcements. We have Micromobility Europe coming up in June 2nd and 3rd in Berlin. So if you haven't bought tickets yet, please get your tickets at micromobility.io. We also have Micromobility America coming up in November 11th and 12th at Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. So tickets are on sale for that as well. With that, let's get started. Horace, welcome back.
Oh, it's always fun to be back, and always thankful for the opportunity.
Great. Which part of the world are you today?
I'm in Spain, on the eastern coastline here, trying to get away from the bad weather everywhere else, apparently.
Got it. So today, Horace, I want to talk to you about new form factors. That's kind of where we want to get started with, because we spent very little time on new form factors in the last episode. I wanted to, get your take on what's happening with new form factors. So, if you look at the last couple of years, we have new form factors coming up. For example, Excite is a very good example. If you go to Amsterdam, it's a growing trend that you see these two-seater vehicles, mostly from Citroen or even Microlino. And there's also another company called Biro, which is very popular. And this is gaining popularity in Amsterdam. Right. And the general trend is that if you look across Europe, I think this category is going to grow. If you look at cities, in terms of regulations, things are changing as well. Many cities are thinking about how to accommodate this. And a very interesting thing is, if you look at how Google's autonomous vehicle project came along many years ago, they used to have a vehicle, a two-seater vehicle, no steering wheel, no brakes, nothing. It used to be called as Google Firefly. It's a I would, if you look at the weight and form factor and the speed limit, speed was capped at 25 miles per hour, I believe. So that's like roughly around 40 kilometers per hour. So it technically falls under the category of micromobility, right? And in a world where autonomous mobility is the norm, maybe like 10, 20 years from now, I don't think we would have SUVs driving around in cities, because we don't need them. We would probably have these small pods moving around. Right. Just wanted to get your thoughts. Have you thought about these new form factors? How do you see these evolving?
Yeah, actually, one of the reasons I started looking into this idea of micromobility was because I was noticing this at the time. It was called new sort of neighborhood electric vehicles, and and there was something going on in China with them, and there was something going on in the U.S. with golf carts. And it was kind of a curious category because it seemed like it was flying under the radar because it wasn't a car and there wasn't market data. I was trying to actually find out how many of these there were in the world, and nobody was tracking this information. And then, of course, they were starting to be electric, obviously, and that went in hand with what was happening with the bigger car. But I want to step back a moment and I want to reflect on something. And that is that the car as we know it today is an anachronism because of the time when it began. When it started, the world was not urbanized as much as it is today. In fact, even the United States was less than half of the population was living in cities. So if you look at the early cars, they were very much, especially the Model T, which kind of was the, let's say, first to demonstrate mass production techniques, which more or less made the diffusion curve grow rapidly and more or less mobilized the United States. But that time was designed by Henry Ford to be a rural vehicle. and it was it was almost what we call today would call an off-roader because it had a huge amount
Mhm.
of ground clearance. It was capable of doing very rough roads, and it had the concept of being the farmer's best friend, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of stories. You can Google this and find out tons of stories about how America took to this vehicle because of its, positioning on the job to be done. And then if you look throughout that period of early development of the automobile, first in the United States, later in Europe, there was still this tendency to make cars for the farmer. The other one that comes to mind is the Citroen de Chevaux, which is
Mhm.
kind of the French people's car. That one was also celebrated for its capacity to cross a plowed field with a basket of eggs in the back that wouldn't break. Now, who needs to carry eggs in the back seat across a plowed field? That was the concept at the time, and we're talking
Mhm.
1930s already here. Of course, it was put on pause during World War II. So come back to the 1940s and 50s, and these are the types of vehicles that are mass produced. Then we had the Beetle, the Mini, and other cars. Actually, the Fiat 500, which I find to be one of the best looking cars ever. These were tiny cars. They were very lightweight, and they were made for this kind of mix between kind of urban and some and rural. Now, what I when I thought about it, you also look at another thing, the signage around automobility. Like you look at the road signs, and they're so anachronistic. The little picture of a steam train, a steam locomotive, as kind of this is a railroad crossing. Tractors with farmers with straw hats as sort of, well, watch out for agricultural vehicles. There's a lot of the signage that is left over from a bygone era. And it's an un it to me, it's an accident of history that we ended up with that form factor that was
Mhm.
not. And then, of course, highways were introduced and speeds and so on, high speeds. And we decided, "Okay, let's make it for the highway, and therefore it has to have safety at 60 plus miles an hour." And that had to also be urban,
Yeah.
essentially, grandfathered into the urban environment. And so it was never a phenomenon that began with urban mobility in mind. This is
Mhm.
one of the curious things. The car is not an urban vehicle.
Yeah.
And to the extent that, let's say, trains are also not urban vehicles, but you can look at the urban version of a train. Well, that's called the subway or the tram. And it's a very
Mhm.
distinctive form factor relative to the high-speed intercity rail.
Yeah.
And so this is one of those curiosities that, like, other form factors adapted. There also, you can look at aviation. You have the short distance flight, aircraft, and then you have long distance, so-called wide body, et cetera, et cetera. It just goes on and
Mhm.
on. But for the car, we sort of try to standardize in a certain way, and all the regulations that have been piled on over the century have kind of um, reinforced this paradigm.
Mhm.
And this is why it's so difficult also to manufacture. You can't do a lot of variation. So we've kind of frozen our innovation when it comes to form factors, primarily because of accidental historical reasons. And so when you see a situation like this, I always point out the fact that change happens. It's not that impossible. We've seen the same thing happen with communication networks, which used to be wired. When we went to wireless,
Yeah.
everything changed. When we had landlines and fixed line for networking and so on, everything moved on. When you move to cellular, you got mobility, you got
Yeah.
compactness, you got size that shrank, and then it's kind of got bigger a little bit. But now we have screens everywhere. We're probably going to be wearing screens, and we're going to,
Mhm.
have all these things going on. So, I've seen this before with compute. I've seen it before with communications. It's been a struggle to see change happen in mobility.
Mhm.
So what's happening with micro is that it's sort of like happening, but is invisible because it isn't measured very well, and
Yeah.
it's also sort of like poking from different corners into our space of visibility.
Mhm.
So one of the things that's exciting is, like, even sort of what would be a very laggard person, to put it nicely, is like Donald Trump suggesting that the U.S. should consider K cars.
Yeah.
Now, if for those of you who aren't familiar, K cars, spelled KEI, are very small Japanese only at this point, Japanese home market, domestic market, which these are very small cars defined by their dimensions primarily. But because Japanese streets can be very small,
Hmm.
especially urban, they've developed this category of very small cars, which turned out to be, they've been trying to kill them off because the automakers in Japan also don't like them. They're not
Yeah.
profitable for them. So the government has almost banned them there, but it turns out that
Hmm.
they have a lot of staying power because they're popular. But anyway, when people observe those cars, they're like, whoa, these are amazing. Why don't we have these things? And for cost reasons, also it would bring down the average selling price and all the other good things for affordability.
Cool.
And so people are just noticing this as an anomaly and saying, what's this all about? So again, it's kind of coming in from different angles because no one's asking the fundamental questions: why a car
Hmm.
so big? Why do
Yeah.
they have to be so big? Why do they have to weigh so much? Why do they have to carry so many people? When, again, most trips are short, most passenger occupancy is about 1.2 to 1.5, and most speeds are slow in cities. In fact,
Yeah.
more and more so as we put in more and more speed limits. So what I'm saying is that there's a lot of things in the background which suggest that this makes a lot of sense, that we should
Hmm.
be creating urban, let's say, four-wheel covered vehicles as
Yeah.
opposed to two-wheelers or three-wheelers, which are great. I think that's the heart of micromobility, but we're seeing
Hmm.
more and more innovation happening with four wheels. And so for that reason, it's always exciting. The Microlino you
Hmm.
mentioned, Excite, which is actually three wheels, but it's more like covered motorcycle, a very
Yeah.
interesting form factor. But also we talked about that. But also if we look at things like um, uh, the quadricycle concept in Europe, which is sort of a well-defined category.
Yeah.
Um, and like I said, golf carts in the U.S. and
Hmm.
other form factors in different countries, and of course in India you have many of these as
Yeah.
well. So
The
my
rickshaws.
my
Yeah.
my my point is that I don't know. It's to me the form factor is partly it's constrained by regulation, but the regulation is not logical given where we're going with
Hmm.
urban society. And it's also not logical when it comes to autonomy for that matter. So let me touch down on a little bit.
Yep.
Before the call, we talked a bit about the fact that Waymo launched with a pod-like vehicle for
Yeah.
their self-driving Waymo technology, and they moved eventually to a full-size SUV type vehicle. And also, if you by the way look at what Tesla is proposing for a robotaxi, it's also a two-seater.
Yeah.
It's not that small, and it's actually logically should be more, let's say, bubble-like. It doesn't need a front like the way it does, and it probably needs more storage in the back and all these other things. It's
Yeah.
probably not the optimal design for a taxi, but there's some logic to it being small. Now, when you pull the thread of uh, the idea of a taxi, an urban taxi, it kind of leads you to a small vehicle.
Hmm.
You're going to have lower, more economy in terms of the energy cost, more ability to traverse tight spaces, and probably park them when you don't need them, etc. So there's a lot of benefits to that form factor as we move into, let's say, an urban taxi, which isn't with a driver.
Hmm.
So it's kind of, these experiments are demonstrating that there's a huge demand for evolution at the small end. And I do
Yeah.
believe long term, it would make a lot more sense if most cars in cities were actually what we would define as micro, because we're
True.
talking about, 500 kilograms, maybe a little bit more, but that's about enough for the
Yeah.
job to be done.
Yeah, you mentioned from looking back at history, for trains, the urban version is the trams and subways. For if you take a flight, there are small flights for a short haul, right? Why do you
Mhm.
think this did not happen in cars? Because if you look at the last, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, the form factor has been the same, right? We did not truly see an urban version
Yeah.
versus a rural version, right?
So here's how I would answer that question. If you were to ask either a car maker or a regulator and ask them, why don't you make a small city car? They're going to say, or why don't you make a like a pod-like vehicle.
Yeah.
They'll say, well, our customers tell us that they want big. Secondly,
Mm.
they'll say safety regulations are such that in the frontal impact, we have to withstand, the cage, the safety cage, and all these other things. They talk
Yeah.
about safety, and they say our hands are tied. We have to essentially make a bigger vehicle. In fact, if you look at even if you look at a category like, let's say,
Mm.
the Mini was small in the 1960s. It was once BMW bought it, it became bigger, and then each generation of the Mini afterwards got bigger and bigger and
Yeah.
bigger. And every step of the way, there was kind of mocked a little bit because there's nothing Mini about it anymore.
Mm.
But they would always answer, well, we have new regulations for pedestrian safety. We have new regulations for various other things. And most of the time, we also have to add all these other accessories that consumers want and space and so on. So there's always this tendency like, well, we can't, this is what the market demands.
Mhm.
And the regulators are like, well, if that's what the market demands, then we're going to make sure you have more and more armor around you, and therefore more and more weight and more bulk.
Yeah.
And also the wheels have to be bigger because you have to withstand bigger cornering forces. So size begets size,
Mhm.
weight begets weight. It's a crisis that actually, I remember years and years ago when I spoke with Gordon Murray, who's the advocate of adding lightness to automobility in general, and so he came from racing,
Mhm.
where in racing lightness is much more valuable than anything else. You want to have something small and light as much as possible. Now, so the answer is, it seems like everybody you ask says we have no choice but to make it bigger.
Mhm.
And then they point to, well, it's the norm, it's the normative issue. And so that's what is expected. It's always been this way. This is what we're required to do. No one steps back and say, why are the regulations the way they are? And that's why when I go back in time and I ask, well, where did all this begin? It began in a different era,
Yeah.
at a different time where the assumptions were totally different. So the idea of sunk costs
Mhm.
comes into play, where the sunk cost means like, we don't want to change because we've invested so much in the way things were. But if
Yeah.
you can be shown that there's a better way forward, then you shouldn't consider that that cost has anything to do with your decision.
Mhm.
It's the
Mhm.
same with roads. Well, the roads are the way they are, and therefore we've got to fit to the roads. Everything has to fit to that. Well, no,
Yeah.
actually, if roads being the way they are were because of the vehicles we had, or the conventions we had, or the rules we had, if you say we're going to travel differently, tear down the roads, rebuild everything, as the Dutch
Mhm.
did indeed. And
Yeah.
so there's this question of like, well, we put so much effort into the past. Why don't we carry on doing it the way we're doing it?
Yeah.
I may have said this before, but this is a great analogy of like two men are digging for gold. They have a
Mm.
map. There's a map that they're reading about where the gold is. The X marks the spot, And then one of them notices after a while, if they dug like a meter or two, he notices that the map's upside down. And then he says, look, we should be digging over there, not over here.
Mhm.
And his companion says to him, but hang on, look how far down we've dug.
Yeah.
Now, the joke isn't so much that, hey, this guy actually thinks she should still be digging in the wrong place.
Yeah.
But then he actually convinces his buddy, so they both start working to
Mhm.
continue digging. So even the one who notices the mistake says, okay, I'll continue doing it wrong because look how far we've gone.
Yeah.
Every decision with infrastructure is like this. So
Mhm.
in many ways, that drives the whole decision process, where no one's stepping back and asking you these foundational questions. You all turn to one another in this matrix of decision making, again, because you have policy, you have government, you have consumers, and everyone points the finger to somebody else who says, well, that's what they say, or
Mhm.
that's what we believe, because that's the convention.
Yeah.
And no one steps back and says this doesn't make any sense at all. To the extent that someone will break this, it might come from either, again, self-driving, to sort of the light comes on and says it doesn't have to be a big heavy vehicle,
Yeah.
to and by the way, that's being chased by a lot of capital, or
Mm.
micromobility, which is much more organic, but it's like demonstrating that you need the battery the size of a few kilograms, and you need a motor, which is this. I say often that's a motor the size of your fist to
Yeah.
move a person. By the way, just a quick note: this doesn't get a lot of airplay, but
Uh-huh.
that company in Finland that has supposedly had a breakthrough in battery technology.
Yep.
It was announced at CES. The company is a motorcycle company called Verge, which is kind of owns the laboratory where they're making the battery called Donut Lab. And both technologies are the motorcycle and the bike and the
Uh-huh.
battery are both from Finland. And no one knows if this is real. It
Yep.
hasn't yet been confirmed, but they're putting their reputations at stake doing, making this
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
statement. And Finns tend not to be, shall we be blunt, they don't tend to
Yeah.
bullshit very much. Um, but nonetheless, we'll see whether that comes out. But the
Uh-huh.
point I would make is, hey, that's micromobility. So the innovations that are happening on micro are fascinating, even because they are a natural place where you experiment, a natural place where you try new things,
Yeah.
and they percolate into later technology. So
True.
even the some batteries that are used in cars today started out aimed at
Uh-huh.
micro. So I won't
Yeah.
get into all the details, but that's
Yeah.
one of the notes.
Yeah. In terms of why we didn't have urban versus rural vehicle, from a car point of view, um, do you think it is also, led by consumer sentiment as well? So for a lot of people, buying a car is still an investment, right? And it's a lot of money, right? So rather than having a rural vehicle and an urban vehicle, maybe their thinking is that, hey, we might as well have just one vehicle. If it's an
Sure.
SUV, I'll use it for rural and also urban, right?
Yeah, that's why we had the notion of unbundling. The idea of
Yeah.
unbundling the car was that, yes, there are different jobs. So you sometimes need a big car and sometimes you need a small car, but why just have one? Especially since the alternative, the small one that you're going to use most of the time, is so small that it kind of fits alongside the existing one. So it doesn't need
Uh-huh.
its own storage or infrastructure. So in many ways, the 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 idea of micromobility is that kind of lives alongside macromobility.
Yeah.
And so, yes, if you only had one vehicle to choose, you'd pick the one that was most versatile, that had
Uh-huh.
like people who buy pickup trucks, they say once in a while I might need to use it for moving, or I have to carry a big item from the big box retail.
Yeah.
But in fact, 99.9% of the time, you never put anything in the back of your truck. In fact, it kind of there's a joke. Jim Gaffigan, a comedian, says has this thing where he says, "Well, it's like someone walking around with a big, one of those big bags you check in on a flight,
Yeah.
and you're just pulling it around with you all the time, and it's always empty. And so people ask you, well, why are you taking a bag everywhere you go? So, well, I might need it. Well, that's how
Yeah.
it is with most people, is they'll just carry all this baggage around without
Uh-huh.
ever really needing it. And it's kind of like it's seen as a marginal cost that doesn't seem to show up in their finances. But that's just because they haven't seen alternatives typically, and no one, consumers might be the ones you listen to, but also don't forget that they're not the ones who are going to innovate. As
Yep.
Steve Jobs says, the job of the innovator is not to ask the customer what they want. It's to find out what they want before they know it. And a problem with that is, like, again, it's called normative behavior. It's like
Uh-huh.
you're just doing it and you don't know why you're just doing it. And so consumers are not the best people to ask.
Yep.
Um, and sometimes going against the grain. There are many examples, even in automotive, where if you did a survey and said back in the 1990s, who wants a sports car? The answer was none.
Uh-huh.
Mazda made the MX-5, which are also known as the Miata. Huge success.
Yep.
Nobody asked for it. And nowadays, I think we're going to see a resurgence of the station wagon, because everybody said I want an SUV, but the one who actually drives a station wagon suddenly looks cool. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of these things like almost retro. And so in some ways, it's just going to be an innovation process that we're going to
True.
see, courage from designers.
Yeah. Yeah. We had one of the founders of Chick. It's a very popular moped sharing company from Amsterdam on the podcast. He was telling me that they actually ran a survey asking users if they would need the hair net to keep the helmet on, and a lot of people said yes. But finally, when they tracked the real usage, nobody was using them. right? Yeah,
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true that consumers are notorious for
true.
making really bad decisions.
Yeah.
The case I remember in business school I had was they did a study of hair mousse, which is this, the foam you put in your
Yeah.
hair.
Yeah.
Terrible. It did terrible in the focus groups.
Okay.
Nobody wanted to try it,
Mhm.
and it's a huge hit.
But coming back to the urban versus rural and these new form factors, right? I am with you that for most of them it's like might as well have just one vehicle which does everything. But at what point do you think people would start saying that, hey, I mean, yeah, I mean, I get it that I need to probably have a vehicle for these long trips, right? These weekend trips, family trips, but for city trips I need to have a completely different form factor. What do you think are, what would push consumers to think that way?
Well, again, let's be clear that innovation from consumers happens through a process that's
Yeah.
well understood. This is the so-called innovation or diffusion process. It was observed many decades ago when it comes to sociological, let's say, dynamics.
Hmm.
And this came to be known as the early adopter versus the mainstream adopter versus the laggard. And there's a even smaller minority than the early adopter called the innovator. This is the terminology before innovators came to mean builders of products, but rather the individual buyers who are innovators. And there are many case studies, and research was based on looking at farmers adopting new seed technologies and looking at like people living in South America in the Andes, being taught to boil water to prevent disease. All these groups were observed, and
Hmm.
and sociologists studied how they transitioned from a normative behavior to its opposite. In
Yep.
other words, cold water is seen as healthy, and hot water is seen as bad. And to convince them you should boil your water before you drink it. And
Hmm.
people thought that adding heat to water would make it actually be dangerous.
Yep.
So they watched that transition, and mostly it was women who made the decisions because they kept the household, right? So
Hmm.
they found that there are some people who will listen to facts and will not just imitate what others do. And this
Yeah.
is this is this is the thing about the middle of the market, the so-called mainstream adopters operate entirely on an imitation basis. That is to say, they'll do something if they see someone else doing it. They are
Hmm.
not willing to listen to any evidence, any data to the contrary. That's
Yep.
not the way they make decisions. And you see this in politics as well. It doesn't matter how much data you provide, that does not enter into their decision making process.
Hmm.
It's all about imitation or hearsay, or I'll believe somebody is honest if somebody else vouches for them. That's
Yeah.
it. That's the only question as to whether someone says the truth or not. Did somebody vouch?
Yep.
That's again, this is the imitation process. So don't ask what causes average people to do new things.
Hmm.
Well, they'll only do it if other average people do the same things. So
Yep.
instead, ask how are the early people, by the way, will be the ones imitated
Hmm.
by some and then others, like a bowling ball knocking pins. One pin knocks another pin, but somebody has to be the first in line. So
Yeah.
the puzzle always for technology marketers is to find those early adopters. And I gave this talk at Micromobility some time ago about, understanding that audience and understanding their job to be done. And their jobs are often like, I want to be the first.
Hmm.
Sometimes this is seen as kind of a dumb thing to do, but people actually want to try it. They're like saying, I'm looking for something that'll change my life. I'm looking for something that changes me. I don't want to be the one that actually influences decisions on other people. There's this a very different job to be done. So
Yeah.
generally speaking, when you say it's a leadership or an innovation process, it's about finding the leaders in the community. And
Hmm.
so this is why this is why micromobility should be targeted to not necessarily the low end as like it's the cheapest. Cheap is attractive to the laggards, actually. Cheap is
Yep.
attractive to the last people in line. You should actually be thinking, how do I make a product that people feel like I'm going to hire this to make progress in life?
Yeah.
I'm going to want to be a leader. I'm going to be the standout. I'm going to be changing the world with this thing, make a dent into the universe, whatever it
Mhm.
is you want to do. So a lot of the people who buy a new idea are not all that price sensitive, which is
Yeah.
another sort of anomaly, really.
Yep.
Not to say you shouldn't do low end. It depends a lot on a lot of things. If you're in a market like Asia, probably you want to do also low end.
Mhm.
But generally, my answer is that it's gradual. There's a stages to it, and you should think about these. Who are you really wanting to attract? The more radical the new thing is, the more likely you need to find people who are willing to take risk.
Yeah, and I also think that there's not a lot of companies out there building in the space. So we have, I mean, Citroen Ami is very popular. We see those vehicles right now. And there's multiple versions of it. There's also the Topolino. It's a variant of that. We also have Opel E-Rocks. It's another variant of that you see in Netherlands. Beyond that, you have Microlino, but you don't have many examples of such companies. I mean, it's just two or three companies that
Yeah,
are
it's
building
still
in the space,
very
right?
early,
Yeah,
or very early on the new form factors.
yeah,
But notice what's happened with e-bikes. Already we're probably 10 year into a cycle there, a
yeah.
little bit older. But let me give you an example. As I said, I'm in Spain now. I was just walking down basically a boardwalk, which is
Hmm.
uh, near a beach. I walked down 1 kilometer on a Sunday afternoon, and there are many restaurants on this place.
Yep.
And I always have been noticing before that there are people who go to these restaurants with e-bikes,
Hmm.
but not just go to restaurants with e-bikes because you see them parked outside, but they go in pairs. They go
Yeah,
together with someone else. Not only that, but they're obviously a couple because they are his and hers, and they're tied up
yeah,
together. And I call this the his and hers e-bikes. And they're actually most likely elderly people because
yeah,
they're retired. They're out here for the sunshine. So I went and counted. I counted 9 pairs within 1 kilometer. That's 18 bikes that were obviously his and hers, tied up together. Even the frames sometimes reflect the different,
yeah.
form factors. But my point is this. Here's a form factor after 10 years that's caught on. By the way, I almost saw no other bikes. This is the only
Mm,
bikes I saw.
mhm.
There are shared scooters in the community, plenty of those as well.
Yep.
And I do see young people on scooters all the time. There's a sort of a fitness gym area.
Yeah.
There's a rack full of scooters in front of it because the kids are playing various sports there. But
Mhm.
as far as the boardwalk where the restaurants are, it's all double e-bikes, as I call them, or his and hers. So the thing is this: the early adopter for the e-bike in these communities, probably Germany as well. I've heard this true. This is true in Germany. Is elderly couples who are retired,
Mm.
but who buy the bikes together in order to journey together, usually for recreation. And they're doing it because it makes them feel youthful. It
Yep.
takes them back to a time when they were young, when cycling was more common. So the thing is, it's fascinating to me when you look at early adopters, you think, oh, they're usually young males or somebody who's like a risk taker. No, these are
Mhm.
elderly people, including female, especially 50%. So
Mhm.
it's fascinating to me how early adopters are not the prototypes. So in that sense, like is the microcar for the city
Mhm.
really going to be about young urban professionals where whatever tearing up, young whatever rebels?
Yep.
No, it could well be delivery people. By the way, the early adopters of e-bikes in New York City are where delivery
Delivery
people,
players. Yeah.
very poor typically, barely, living on tips. And by the way, I was just there a couple of weeks ago in New York City,
Mhm.
and I saw an e-bike being pulled by, an e-bike pulling a power trailer, and I saw a quad e-bike, which was used. Both were Amazon. So
Yep.
this is happening in New York, which I thought was again very lagging from the European. Now it's common in Europe, but it's
Mhm.
coming now to New York City. So we're seeing a lot of interesting dynamics.
Mhm.
and asking this question about who buys this thing early on. And the more you see those things, the more you're likely to, also
Yeah.
think it's legitimate and it's safe and it's on. So I, I, I just, I'm always encouraged, and things may take longer than you expect, but it's such a natural product
Yeah.
for the environment it's in.
Absolutely. I mean, I really hope more brands build in the space, but I mean, like I said, there's only Citroen Ami, Microlino, and a couple of them, and I'm also looking forward to what Excite would bring to the market as well. Right? There's very few, and we need like more examples of that. But staying on that point, do you think when I'm assuming that in the next 10 years, autonomous mobility becomes the norm in many cities. Do you think that could be a kind of a breaking point where we see this urban versus rural divide, and divide meaning in terms of form factors, and probably that's the right moment to you know transition, and maybe within that time frame users might not say, hey, I mean, let me buy a Citroen Ami and also have another vehicle.
Okay, first, let's say that there is a potential for disruption with self-driving. And now
Yeah.
this is more in the realm of fantasy right now, but it is
Uh-huh.
still it does exist, and it's going to have its own adoption curve. To say that a robotaxi or a Waymo taxi will displace car ownership is probably as likely as e-bikes replacing car ownership.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Uh-huh.
but but it is one of those things that we have to pay attention to, because it does people will rethink and ask themselves questions when they see, especially the form factor. And by the way, the reason the form factor might evolve it to a microcar
Yeah.
for urban taxi is because economics plays a strong part in any fleet um, buyer's mind. So the economics of the smaller, first of all, you want to have a vehicle that a taxi typically is in use a lot more
Yeah.
than a personal car. A personal car is utilized or is utilized 96% of its life.
Mm.
Or its duration of life. So, it's only 4% utilization rate. A taxi might be 90%, because you should never stop a taxi running. You should just be fueling it, servicing it, and then go back to work. And so, you look at taxi fleets, which are human driven, the vehicle should have like 95% utilization.
Yeah.
That's a rule, and that's how you pay off the all the costs involved
Uh-huh.
in running it. And we'll see what the dynamic is going to be in terms of utilization. So for that reason, they want to have ruggedized or more or less strong vehicles that for some markets they have customized it, like the London taxi is a
Yeah.
famous example. I think in India also they were using some ancient vehicles, and in Japan they were
Yeah.
using some more or less ancient vehicles as the standard taxi. They were decades old, but the reason was that those were known to be reliable, known to be rugged compared to
Uh-huh.
the consumer stuff that's available today. So the interesting dynamic there is, like, you can see someone thinking about this and saying we want to have a vehicle that's fit for purpose. It has to be rugged, it has to have high utilization, and probably to be as efficient as possible from cost point of view as well to
Uh-huh.
build. And therefore, why does it need extras? Why does it need all this other stuff?
Yeah.
So, if you look at a London taxi, you can seat up to six passengers. If you took the driver out of there and you took the engine out of there, it would be just like a bread loaf. It
Yeah.
was just and that's the form factor. And then if somebody says, "Hold on, we don't really need six passengers," the argument being made for Cybercab is like 90% of trips are single passenger, maybe
Yeah.
two at most. It's a rare, maybe you throw some bags in the back. And by the way, if you
Mhm.
need to carry six people to an event, just book three taxis,
Yeah.
three rides. So there's a logic to having a passenger capacity down to two. And then you
Uh-huh.
see the size shrink. And suddenly people are realizing, hang on, what the hell's going on here? Wouldn't it be nice if I had something like this? So again,
Uh-huh.
it might influence the consumer market. But this is where, it's kind of it's a puzzle as to how people finally observe and decide.
Yeah.
Because again, you could ask the same question, why did we end up with SUVs?
Uh-huh.
who was copying what, and why would you do that? It made more sense to have a minivan if you want to carry a lot of people, and
Uh-huh.
minivans pretty much disappeared because people said, "Oh, it's not in my style." And so the SUV was even though nobody off roads, it was kind of become the rugged thing. But as fast as that grew, I think it's going to be also quickly
Yeah.
out of fashion at some point.
Got it. So on the autonomous micro car, I mean, if that becomes a reality, I was wondering how Apple would play into all this, because Apple was trying to build a vehicle, and in a world where you have like autonomous micro vehicles, I was thinking that Apple probably will capture the entire human
Well, that's
machine
why they
interface.
started. So they started this in 2014. In fact, because of that, I started a podcast called A SIM Card just to talk about it. This is
Uh-huh.
before micromobility. So they've spent years and years before they gave up. And the reason they
Yeah.
gave up was because they said, well, we thought autonomy would come sooner than later. And all
Uh-huh.
the rumors that have come out as to the form factor, it was going to be a bread loaf. It was going to
Uh-huh.
be essentially a small minivan type form factor. And it was all about the interior, not the exterior. It was about the space inside the vehicle to do other things instead of drive or face forward, look out the window, which is the notion of driving is like, that's why you have this staging effect. Everybody faces towards the theater stage, which
Yeah.
is the windshield. And if you rethink that whole dynamic and say, well, we don't have to look out the windshield, so then you reorient it towards the interior. And the idea of it was give something for people to do while they're inside the vehicle,
Uh-huh.
either meeting with each other and so on. I mean, the idea of there's a funny. I remember this anecdote. A lot of there were these car sharing services, and one of the car sharing services was in Japan, and
Uh-huh.
they found that these young people were renting cars but not going anywhere. Why? Because they wanted a place to be alone, maybe to take a nap and
Yeah.
to have some time by themselves in a society filled with like too much stimuli.
Uh-huh.
So the idea of that space in the car became like one of the cheapest way to rent a room. It was to rent
Yeah.
this car. And so when you see the car as space, it's totally transforming your thinking. Not to mention Marchetti's constant suggests we're all in there for about an hour a day. But
Yeah.
if you're going to have a taxi, it's going to be reused and stuff like that. So the economics is different. But I would say that what makes sense is again is a form factor. If it's social, then it's going to be like a van. If
Uh-huh.
it's transportation only, it's going to be a cube, or a little pod, and it's going to just maybe you'll have a screen to look at. Maybe you bring your own screen with you. Doesn't
Yeah.
matter. What's outside is you know a limo. It's like famous because the windows are tinted and people can't see in, and
Uh-huh.
maybe you pull curtains and you don't see out either. You cocoon yourself. Again, ridden micro as opposed to driven micro, but ridden micro is all about looking outside. I always
Yeah.
point out like micromobilities keep your head chin up, keep your
Uh-huh.
head looking and tall.
Uh-huh.
When you're standing on the scooter, you're above the eye sight line of most cars. So the idea is very much the opposite. So double down on it. You know, you're
Yeah.
gonna put people in the box, make the box interesting, make it so that they do something there, and you capture that Marchetti's constant time with entertainment or productivity or other things that software delivers, or and those guys who come from software and looking at cars are basically, I'm going to steal that hour
Mm.
that people use it just to look out the window. So the logic of self-driving is more about like taking that Marchetti's constant. But I always puzzled by this because we already put 4 hours a day into our phones. So adding another hour of screen time, which normally
Uh-huh.
is driven time, to is that worth that much? I don't see
Yeah.
I don't see where the economics of this thing turns into trillions of dollars. This is the problem.
Uh-huh.
If it's a utility function and say, "Oh, I'm saving the transportation time," that's going to go to zero very quickly because so much competition is going to come in, and everybody's going to essentially offer rides for nearly nothing. So you're not going to be able to capture a lot of costs, a lot of dollars from reducing costs.
Uh-huh.
Um, and this is why, to me, the problem is with transportation economics is that the utility function is fairly a bad business. Okay. Whereas if you find ways of monetizing the journey in other ways than saying dollar per mile, then you suddenly have huge business opportunity. And I think uh, both shared, oh, sorry, both micro and
Yeah.
self-driving have their own potential attack vectors into
Mhm.
that Marchetti's 1 hour.
Don't you think CarPlay as we know it would be completely different in such a world, and that would enable users to consume content within such a vehicle, connect your phone to the vehicle,
Yeah,
consume videos,
here's
or
my cynical point of view. I think the first thing you're going to do once you enter into into a cyber cab or taxi
yeah.
is you're going to pull your phone out and stare at it. You're going to be offered screens, but who wants to log in, have it
Yeah.
configured, download your profile, and what for a 20-minute, 10-minute ride?
Yeah.
No, you're gonna whip your phone out and stare at it. And the
Yeah.
driver, if you're gonna go for a 1 hour trip, you're gonna will take your phone out and scroll. It's always the phone is such a better alternative, and
Mhm.
it's yours, and it's all that stuff. All those screens in even on airplanes, you always have screens in airplanes,
Mhm.
but I see more and more people are just bringing their own downloads and looking at their own
Yeah.
screens. And so I I'm reluctant to say that the vehicle is going to provide the entertainment rather. And I think part of the reason Apple also moved away from that is said, well, if we just put CarPlay in it, maybe we get some dollars, but basically that the phone is already dominating that in-car experience. And
Mhm.
you don't need to build a big box
Yeah.
when the screen is in your pocket. You
Mhm.
don't need a big box to put screens into it. You know, it's this whole idea of the car is an accessory to your phone. I
Mhm.
used to talk about this. I said the car is essentially, as long as it has Bluetooth, you know, it's gonna turn into a phone, appendage, not
Yeah.
the other way around. So that's why Ami, you mentioned Ami, and it's like, you're much smarter just getting rid of all screens and saying, "Well, just plug your phone in. We got a charging port, we got a nice mount for it. You know, download our app if you want instrumentation or you want directions or anything else.
Yeah.
That's your screen. Anyway, you bring it with you."
So if you look at when we had e-scooters, e-bikes, the biggest argument then was that it's going to replace a lot of car trips. I mean, it did replace a bunch of car trips, but not a lot of car trips, right? So when you have a new form factor like a microcar, which direction does it tilt? I mean, will it take more car trips away, or do you think it's going to replace all the two-wheel trips that we have today?
Well, don't forget that the argument for micro was not just that it might replace some car trips, and I
Yep,
think it has. I think anything it
absolutely.
replaces has been economic value plus environmental value, but also has created its own demand. So obviously, people take trips that they wouldn't have otherwise, and that actually is a more powerful form of demand demand you want to have is the one you created yourself, as
Yep.
opposed to demand that you're taking from someone else, because someone else may fight for it, but if you created it yourself, it's kind of unclaimed. It's it's the frontier, unclaimed frontier. You know, you're getting something for
Mhm.
that wasn't there. So I do believe that the greatest innovations create their own demand. Classic case again,
Okay.
smartphone. Most of the things you do on the smartphone you didn't do 20 years ago at all.
Yeah.
It created its own demand. Social media, namely, is the biggest one there. But okay, but yes, would a microcar now, if it was introduced, just be eating away at the incumbent? And the incumbency might again react by saying, "Let's ban these things," and you'll see it
Mm.
immediately.
Yep.
If it's eating into their core, they're going to say, "Oh, safety hazard. Oh, it's unfair. Built by the wrong people. Whatever
Yeah.
it is you want to declare." And we're seeing this with micro anyway. People are just suddenly realizing or deciding that it's a menace to society, a person with a tiny little machine versus a person in a big machine doing hundreds of kilometers an hour, and many thousands, if not millions, dying from that behavior.
Mhm.
But that's how it is, and then it'll change over time. It's inevitable.
Yep.
Um, but anyway, yes, I do think the micro vehicle would initially, again, be competitive on economic basis, but I think over time people will start to think about, can I do trips with this that I couldn't do otherwise? Now, to make that possible, you need to change parking laws. You need to change like where you can go with it.
Yeah.
So case in point would be, let's look at it from a delivery point of view. The delivery paradigm was the van delivering packages into an urban center. Now, as urban centers get pedestrianized, suddenly the van doesn't fit anymore, and couriers have trouble now reaching tons of buildings that are in
Yeah.
these zones of pedestrian zones. So the couriers have adapted to essentially using micromobility to deliver packages. So they can go into pedestrianized zones and they can go into bike lanes and so on. And suddenly now the business is viable. Um, Again, for consumers, there might be an interesting opportunity there because they want to go to the city center, but there's no parking or the parking is unaffordable, in
Yeah.
which case they're going to maybe open up special zones for parking your micro vehicle, even to the point where it's a four-wheeler, and it's a lower cost. I'm reminded once I was in Buenos Aires, and the problem they had was that people were parking their bikes like on sidewalks or their motorbikes in like tied to trees and places that were just in the public spaces. And the government of the city said, wait, we're going to put a ban to this. You can't park a motorbike or a moped or two-wheeler just
Hmm.
on random spaces. And but people were like, but I can't go into parking garages because the
Yeah.
garages don't accept motorbikes. And so they then turned to the garages and said, you must provide parking for motorbikes.
Mm.
In fact, this is the portion of your space that you have to allocate. So that was a decision which then meant that you could finally go back to commuting with a two-wheeler. Into why you wanted to go in the first place was you got through traffic faster. You
Yeah.
had lower cost in general, etc. So the two-wheeler business, therefore, the two-wheeler solution, therefore, had to be coupled with a parking solution. So this is how you work your way in with vehicles for consumers. You say, okay, in order to encourage micro vehicle use, cities will create, mandate, or otherwise accommodate
Yeah.
the parking in urban area that is now car free, and therefore suddenly people are like, yay, I can come from the suburb, and you know um or yeah, so that's the problem. It's like it's a four-wheeler, but it's you can find parking
Yeah.
in places you couldn't take a car.
Exactly. I think Amsterdam is doing a good job there. So they now have dedicated micro car parking places. So these are like small, much smaller than the traditional car parking spaces. And I see them a lot in Amsterdam. I was in Amsterdam a couple of weeks
I
ago.
used to
I see them a lot.
yeah
Yeah.
I used to say, and this is one of those 10 commandments, probably, if I remember correctly. It said, as parking goes, so goes the car.
Yeah.
And it's a corollary to, if you want to know the future of the car, study roads.
Uh,
So you can't, by the way, the same with phones and computers. If you want to understand cell phones, understand that there has to be cell phone networks.
yeah.
And cell phone networks was as important in the beginning and their evolution to 5G, where you have faster cellular than you do on Wi-Fi.
Uh,
All that happened over a long period, but it absolutely is an enabling idea. So the enablement of micro will be through infrastructure. It's also going to be the main reason it doesn't get adopted. So it's both an enabler and a disabler.
yeah.
But it's like if you make the right conversation and you demonstrate the opportunity, again, I think it becomes an enabler. And so
Yeah.
the thing will flip, and when it flips, it's amazingly fast. Because if cities simultaneously say, like Buenos Aires is like, on one hand you ban things, but you give an alternative. So you ban normal cars, and then you say, oh, but we have a way out. We have a,
Yeah.
a, a four-wheeler option, and we have a two-wheeler option, and we have a transit option as well. Of course, the transit has always been another corollary. It's our
Yeah.
favorite brother in micromobility, right? is in transit. I never speak badly about it, but it just doesn't solve all the demand that exists out there. So yes, it's super important that it go hand in hand with infrastructure, and we understand. So again, as I said before about early adopters, you also need to build infrastructure. Like the old saying goes, you don't measure the demand for um, um, a bridge by counting how many people swim across the river, because once you build a bridge, you'll have a lot of people crossing it.
Yeah.
No
Yeah.
one's jumping in the water today, right? So that's why we have to think about it from the point of view of city, and getting those folks to understand what this is. The
Yeah.
tragic thing is that many times those folks who are in decision making capacity are not as well informed about the technologies, and especially with respect to these kind of, let's say, um, let's say, hard to explain technologies, right?
Yeah.
They also are imitators. They're also
Yeah.
looking over their shoulder. They're also saying, "I'll do it if somebody else does it." So the same dynamic. I used to say, if you made your customer be the governments of cities, you still have tens of thousands of them
Yeah.
worldwide
Yeah.
to contend with, and decide where's my early adopters. And if those early adopters are chosen, will there be around them a sufficient number of imitators? Because the problem is, if you do an early adoption in Paris, but nobody else follows them in North America, it's because they're not paying attention in Paris. It doesn't.
True.
That's the problem with cities, is that they don't tend to rub shoulders with each other very
Yeah.
often. I mean, they go on academic tours, and there's a lot of fact finding going on, but it's like the feeling of, I need to do this, doesn't exist, because there's also constituencies and it's messy, so
Yeah.
politically messy. But I would still argue that the process is about early adoption, understanding the dynamic, and
Yeah.
figuring it out.
Yeah, from a policy point of view, it is also very challenging because there's no real classification for microcars. They actually fall under the moped category in Europe, right? So just to give you an idea, in Brussels you have these tunnels. Speed is capped at 50 kilometers per hour. Microcars are not allowed there because they are classified as mopeds, because mopeds are not allowed in those tunnels, right?
Yeah, I
So
know this in France is called voiture sans permis.
yeah,
And they are also with a number plate, which is a motorcycle, basically.
yeah,
Or maybe in France they don't even have one, but I know in Finland they're called mopocars,
mhm,
or these are 50cc engined, a legacy, right,
yeah,
from these vehicles for essentially farmers' children
mhm,
almost. Like, these were mostly in the countryside, but they were a 50cc engine, which isn't much, and they had therefore a moped license and a moped speed,
yeah,
with, by the way, two-stroke engines, which made a lot of pollution. Now those are electrified, but they fall under the old regime. So what you have to do is pound the table in Brussels, that is maybe in the EU part of Brussels, or at the government, the country level governments, and say, you guys are so far behind. Electrification transforms transportation. Software transforms transportation, and communications transform. You know all this.
yeah,
Case, compute, or communicate. This is McKinsey's term. Communications, autonomy. E is for electric, and I think S is self-driving. So
mhm,
those are the four things, right? Case. Now, if you say those things apply to all vehicles, not just cars,
yeah,
that case will apply to micro as well, all the way down to a shoe with a motor in it, with a wheel in it, like
yeah,
a child's toy. So you can imagine, rollerblades to microcars. All of that we cover as micro. That's why we define micro to
yeah,
exist. It's everything that's not a car, below the car. Now, all of that injection of software, injection of uh, uh, communications, and injection of electrification is happening there even faster, very, very fast.
yeah,
Lots of iteration. Now you have to step back and say, we can't even build these things because you don't give us categories to fit into, because you have legacy categories. So we have to bend over backwards to say, oh, this is an e-bike that goes over a certain speed and this and that. And you're imposing then new regulations and saying, well, a scooter can't go over 25 kilometers an hour.
Yeah.
And you're putting all these in European regulations and saying, put the burden on the new guy who actually is doing the greatest thing as far as emissions, as far as enablement of the unserved,
True.
and so on and so on, and explain that if you redefine the categories, we will see things emerge into these categories, especially so the categories are legacy, but if you created new ones, you will have people targeting them because we already target what is available because we
Yeah.
can't ship otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, from a policy point of view, I really hope that things will change. And I think a bunch of companies, they are fighting for it as well. And I think it's a new category that is evolving, and we probably will see more of these in every city, right? We just ran out of time, but it was a pleasure talking to you. I think we spent almost an hour talking about microcars.
I think you gave me a longer list than this, but yeah, that's
Yeah,
how it happens
but
always.
yeah, but I think it's a conversation that has to happen because new form factors are not always looked upon. I mean, cities are not talking a lot about these form factors, and I'm glad we took an hour to talk about them. Thank you so much, Horace. Always a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure as well. Thank you.